Usually when we think of a historical icon, there is this expectation of permanence.
Right, like it's set in stone.
Exactly, like a bronze statue in a park. You look up at the marble face, you read the plaque, and you just accept that this is exactly who they were and how they always will be.
Mhm.
But then you step into the world of paleontology, and suddenly that statue starts shifting.
Oh, constantly.
Yeah, we're looking at a historical landscape that is just constantly rewriting itself right before our eyes. So we are launching into our very first Dinosaur Stories deep dive today, and the mission is clear.
I am so ready for this.
We are taking the ultimate prehistoric icon, the undisputed monarch of your childhood toy box, the Tyrannosaurus Rex, and we are shattering the Hollywood myths.
We really have to.
Right. We're going to dig into the mind-blowing recent discoveries that completely rebuild the true T-Rex from the ground up.
Because the animal we understand today is radically different and honestly far more terrifying and complex than the lumbering monster we thought we knew even just 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
It requires a complete teardown of our preconceptions, starting all the way back at the moment humanity first put a label on it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because even the name itself has a totally bizarre history.
It really does.
Tyrannosaurus Rex, the Tyrant Lizard King. It was officially discovered in 1902 by this flamboyant paleontologist named Barnum Brown, who loved it so much he called it his favorite child.
Yeah, he was quite the character.
But then you have someone like Jack Horner, a legendary paleontologist who advised the biggest dinosaur films in history, who actively disliked the T-Rex.
Right, he was famously not a fan.
He openly preferred hadrosaurs, those duck-billed dinosaurs that the T-Rex actively hunted. So the king of the dinosaurs has always been a polarizing figure, but the real drama is how it barely even got its name.
Yeah, the naming convention of the T-Rex is this brilliant quirk of scientific bureaucracy.
Oh, it's wild.
So during the infamous Bone Wars, which was this period of intense, often bitter fossil hunting competition in the late 19th century, paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope actually found the first T-Rex fossils in 1892.
Wait, 1892?
Yeah, 10 years before Barnum Brown.
Yeah.
But because the fossils were fragmentary, he named the creature Manospondylus gigas, which translates to the rather uninspiring giant porous vertebra.
Well, that definitely lacks a certain marketing punch.
Just a bit, yeah. And because it wasn't a complete skeleton, Cope essentially filed it away and forgot about it.
Wow.
Then Barnum Brown finds two incredible massive specimens a decade later. His boss, Henry Fairfield Osborn, sits down to write a paper in 1905 describing them.
Right.
But Osborn didn't realize these two skeletons were actually the same species because they were found in different locations and had, slight variations. So in the exact same publication, he names one specimen Dinosaurus imperiosus and the other Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Okay, so he names the same animal twice in one paper.
Exactly. And when Osborn realized his taxonomic mistake a year later, the strict rules of scientific naming dictated that the first name published is the one that becomes permanent.
Right, the rule of priority.
Yep. But because both names were published in the same document, it literally came down to the page layout.
You're kidding.
Nope. T-Rex appeared a few pages earlier in the journal than Dinosaurus.
So the most famous brand name in the history of planet Earth was secured by a typesetting decision.
Pretty much. And years later, the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature had to invoke special powers to permanently protect the name T-Rex from Cope's older, forgotten Manospondylus designation.
Just because it was already too famous.
Exactly. The cultural momentum of T-Rex was just too massive to reverse.
That is amazing. So the Tyrant Lizard King was an accident of publishing, but the way this animal actually lived is even more unexpected, especially when you realize the king started out as a fluffy piece of prey.
Oh, entirely. Think about the extreme vulnerability here. A T-Rex emerged from an egg roughly 30 centimeters long.
So, like the size of a loaf of bread.
Yeah, pretty much. It entered the world about the size of a skinny, incredibly fragile turkey. And the fossil record strongly suggests these tiny chicks were completely covered in a dense coat of downy fuzz, functioning very much like the insulation on a modern duckling.
Okay, so I am picturing a toothy, highly aggressive duckling.
It's an accurate picture.
But that fuzz wouldn't protect them from the reality of the Cretaceous food web, right? The mortality rate for these chicks had to be staggering.
It was an absolute gauntlet. Paleontologists estimate that over 50 to 60% of all T-Rex chicks died in their very first year.
50 to 60%.
Yeah, they succumbed to starvation, disease, or were simply eaten by other predators in the ecosystem,
Jeez.
which heavily included, by the way, other larger tyrannosaurs.
Of course it did. But the ones that did survive this gauntlet, they hit a biological trigger that is almost impossible to comprehend in modern terms.
Yeah, so around the age of 14, the survivors entered an extreme exponential growth phase.
Right.
Studies of the cortical growth, rings in their fossilized bones, which develop annually, sort of similar to the rings in a tree trunk, show that during this teenage phase, a T-Rex was packing on roughly 600 kilograms of mass a year.
Wait, I have to push back on the biological math here.
It sounds impossible, I know.
That is about 1,300 pounds annually. Gaining the weight of a fully loaded grand piano every single year isn't just a growth spurt.
No, it's not.
That is an explosive metabolic transformation. You're taking the biological equivalent of a lightweight sports car and asking it to swap its chassis for a heavy-duty diesel freight train mid-race.
That's a great way to put it.
The sheer caloric demand to fuel a 600-kilogram-a-year growth phase should cause them to starve to death in a competitive environment. How do you fuel that transition without exhausting your food supply?
Well, what's fascinating here is how their anatomy solved that exact caloric crisis through extreme ecological niche partitioning.
Meaning they weren't competing with the adults.
Exactly. The teenage T-Rex didn't look or act anything like the adults. They were sleek, with exceptionally long, slender legs, and their jaws were lined with blade-like teeth meant for slicing meat, not crushing bone.
Okay.
Because they were fast and relatively lightweight, these juveniles hunted entirely different prey, likely small, fast-moving dinosaurs like ornithomimids.
So they were chasing down the quick stuff.
Yep. The massive 8-ton adults were too slow to catch those, so they focused instead on heavily armored, slow-moving ceratopsians like Triceratops.
Oh, wow.
So the teenagers and the adults essentially operated as two completely different predator species, ensuring they never competed for the same calories.
Which fundamentally changes how we view their dominance. And there's a brand new 2026 study analyzing 17 different Tyrannosaur specimens that suggests this teenage phase was much longer than we thought.
Right. The previous consensus was always that they hit their full adult bulk by age 20.
Okay.
But this new statistical modeling of bone histology suggests a much more prolonged growth curve. It might have taken them up to 40 years to reach their maximum 8-ton size.
Wait, 40 years?
Up to 40 years, yeah. This extended subadult phase means the sleek, mid-sized tyrannosaurs dominated the middle tiers of the food chain for decades before finally transitioning into the apex predator role.
So they controlled multiple levels of the ecosystem simultaneously.
Exactly.
Now, because they occupied completely different ecological niches, those sleek, lightweight teens looked so drastically different from the bulky adults that it actually broke our taxonomic models.
It really did.
This physical gap created a massive, decades-long identity crisis for paleontologists.
Oh, it triggered one of the most fiercely debated topics in modern paleontology. For years, scientists kept unearthing these smaller, gracile tyrannosaur fossils.
Like the dueling dinosaurs.
Yes, the most famous being the dueling dinosaur specimen found in Montana. The community just fractured over how to classify them.
Because they didn't look like T-Rexes.
Right. One camp argued these were just teenage T-Rexes caught in that sleek growth phase. The other camp argued this was a completely distinct, smaller species of tyrannosaur living right alongside the T-Rex, which they named Nanotyrannus lancensis.
But wait, if Nanotyrannus was a separate, smaller predator, and teenage T-Rexes were also sleek, mid-sized runners, wouldn't they be bumping into each other?
That's exactly the issue.
Like competing for the exact same prey in the exact same territory.
Yeah, that ecological overlap was a major point of contention. But recent, highly detailed osteological analysis has definitively resolved the debate.
Okay, what do they find?
Nanotyrannus was its own distinct animal.
Really?
Yes, researchers didn't just look at the size of the bones, they looked at the spinal sutures.
Ah.
Bone remodels and fuses as an animal ages. The sutures on these small tyrannosaurs were fully fused, screaming to the researchers that this animal was completely physically mature when it died.
So the skeletal engineering was fundamentally locked in. It wasn't a teenager with decades of growing left to do.
It's exactly. Yeah. Furthermore, the Nanotyrannus skeletons possess significantly larger hands, a higher tooth count, fewer tail vertebrae, and a completely distinct pattern of cranial nerves running through the skull.
Wow, cranial nerves too.
Yeah, and those biological traits are fixed very early in embryonic development, A nanotyrannus could not eventually grow up into a T-Rex.
They were just two separate predators sharing the same Cretaceous landscape.
Right, likely hunting slightly different prey to avoid direct competition.
You know, it seems like paleontology went through a phase of trying to split the Tyrannosaur family tree into as many branches as possible.
Oh, for sure.
Because a few years ago, the internet went completely wild over a proposal that there were actually 3 distinct species of the T-Rex itself.
Yeah, you were referring to a highly controversial 2022 proposal by researcher Gregory S. Paul.
Yes, that's the one.
He published a paper attempting to split Tyrannosaurus rex into 3 separate species. T. imperator, which is the emperor, T. regina, the queen, and the classic T-Rex.
An emperor, a queen, and a king. I mean, the branding is certainly dramatic, but did the scientific community actually buy into it?
Impartially reporting the state of the science here, the vast majority of paleontologists rejected the proposal almost immediately.
Really? Why?
While the argument relied entirely on observed variations in the robust thickness of their femur bones and the presence or absence of certain small, chisel-like teeth in the lower jaw.
Okay, that sounds pretty specific.
It does, but experts from institutions globally published detailed rebuttals stating the statistical evidence simply wasn't robust enough. The variations in bone thickness are widely attributed to natural variation within a single species, or sexual dimorphism.
Right, like males and females just having different bone densities.
Exactly. Think about the vast morphological differences between 2 modern human skeletons in terms of height and robust bone structure.
Oh, sure, that makes total sense.
Furthermore, the supposed tooth differences didn't consistently align with the bone thickness across the fossil record, so the king retains the singular crown.
Well, having sorted out the family tree and that 40-year awkward teenage phase, we have to look at the final form.
The apex predator.
Yeah, the 13-meter-long, 8-ton adult that emerges from this gauntlet. Because here's where it gets really interesting, and where the classic Jurassic pop culture image completely falls apart.
Oh, the visual and physiological updates we have now are striking.
Let's start with the face.
Huh.
Because the iconic crocodile smile, with the jagged, bone-crushing teeth constantly hanging out of its mouth, is physically incorrect, right?
Totally incorrect. Science now points heavily towards scaly lips that completely enclosed their teeth when the mouth was closed.
So looking much more like a modern Komodo dragon.
Exactly. And the biomechanics of their teeth literally demand it.
How so?
The enamel on those massive teeth requires constant hydration from saliva to maintain its structural integrity. If those teeth were constantly exposed to the dry Cretaceous air, the enamel would become brittle.
Ah, I never thought about that.
Yeah, and when an 8-ton animal bites down with thousands of pounds of force into the armored frill of a triceratops, a brittle tooth will shatter. The lips were a biological necessity for weapon maintenance.
That is fascinating. And then the great feather debate adds another layer to all this.
It does, yeah.
We know early, smaller relatives in the Tyrannosaur lineage, like Eutyrannus, were completely covered in dense feathers. So the logical jump for a long time was that the adult T-Rex might have been a giant fluffy bird.
Right. But the current consensus has landed in a much more nuanced middle ground.
Okay.
We have recovered actual fossilized skin impressions from adult T-Rex specimens, such as a famous specimen named Y-Rex, which clearly show patches of mosaic reptilian scales on the tail, hip, and neck.
So they were scaly.
Mostly, yes. However, given its evolutionary lineage, it is highly probable the adults retained selective plumage. Many researchers modeled them with a crest or a mullet of display feathers along the top of the head, the back of the neck, and perhaps down the spine. Yeah, kind of a feathered mane.
Yeah.
These would not be for insulation, but rather for species recognition, intimidation displays, or mating rituals.
Wow. A giant lip-smacking predator rocking a feathered display mullet. It is both majestic and deeply unsettling.
It's quite an image.
But it wasn't just a brute force machine either. The CT scans of their brain cavities show an animal that was basically a walking sensory radar dish.
Oh, absolutely. Their sensory processing makes them an unparalleled apex predator. Starting with vision, they possessed eyes the size of large grapefruits.
Grapefruits, that is huge.
Yep. And unlike many dinosaurs whose eyes faced laterally to scan for danger, a T-Rex's eyes were angled forward. This provided overlapping fields of vision, granting them exceptional binocular vision to judge distance and depth with lethal precision.
So standing perfectly still absolutely would not save you. They could see you in high definition.
Yeah, that movie myth is definitely busted. Their visual acuity was likely superior to a modern hawk.
Unbelievable.
And even if you hit out of sight, They're olfactory bulbs. The region of the brain dedicated to smell were abnormally massive compared to the rest of the cerebrum. They could likely track a carcass or scent a wounded animal from miles away.
Okay, so they have hawk vision and super smell.
And it gets worse. When you combine that with their inner ear structure, specifically an elongated cochlea, exquisitely tuned to low-frequency sounds, the picture becomes truly terrifying.
Wait, what does low-frequency hearing let them do?
They didn't just hear, they could physically feel the deep, vibrating thuds of giant herbivores moving through the dense forest long before making visual contact.
That is basically a superpower. But let me push back on the internal thermodynamics here, because this raises a massive physiological puzzle.
Okay, hit me.
If you have an 8-ton animal generating immense heat from all that muscle mass, potentially wearing a cape of display feathers and operating in a hothouse Cretaceous climate, the math on their thermodynamics seems completely broken. Because the bigger an animal gets, its volume increases exponentially faster than its surface area, making it incredibly hard to shed heat. Why didn't they just cook from the inside out?
It's a great question.
Like, an elephant has giant vascular ears to cool down. What was the T-Rex's radiator?
So this raises an important question that actually baffled scientists for decades. Were they cold-blooded reptiles relying on the sun, or warm-blooded mammals burning calories like a furnace?
Right.
The answer is a dynamic strategy called mesothermy. They managed their body heat in a middle ground, producing internal heat, but not maintaining the strict, high-metabolism thermostat of a mammal.
Okay, so they ran a bit cooler.
Exactly. And to prevent their massive brains from cooking, their skulls possessed built-in air conditioning.
Wait, really? Air conditioning in the skull?
Yep. The giant holes in the roof of their skull, called fenestrae, were originally thought to merely lighten the weight of the head. We now know they were packed with dense networks of blood vessels.
Oh.
These fenestrae functioned exactly like a thermal radiator, exchanging heat with the outside air and venting excess temperature straight out of the top of their heads.
A biological cooling vent built right into the skull.
I
That
know.
is wild.
Nature is pretty clever.
So if you have a creature this massive, generating this much internal heat, movement becomes a serious biological currency. They can't just waste energy running around the landscape.
No, not at all. Physics has unfortunately caught up with the cinematic image of the sprinting T-Rex.
R.I.P. to the Jeep chase scene.
Yeah, exactly. A fascinating Dutch biomechanics study recently calculated the animal's preferred resonant walking speed. To maximize energy conservation, an adult T-Rex trolled through the forest at a leisurely 2.86 miles per hour.
2.86. We've known for a while they weren't chasing down Jeeps at 45 miles an hour, but 2.86 miles per hour fundamentally changes the hunting dynamic.
It really does.
That is human walking speed. If an apex predator is operating at a brisk stroll, it isn't chasing prey down across open plains. It has to be an ambush predator.
Yeah, the 2.86 miles per hour is all about extreme passive efficiency. And the key to that efficiency was its tail.
How does the tail help it walk?
Well, a fully grown T-Rex tail weighed roughly 1,000 kilograms. It didn't drag on the ground. It was suspended horizontally by a massive network of elastic ligaments.
Okay.
As the animal stepped, that 1,000-kilogram tail would gently bounce up and down. Those ligaments acted like a giant biological suspension bridge.
Oh, so it's returning energy.
Exactly. They stored elastic energy as the tail dropped and released it as it bounced back up, literally springing the animal forward into its next step with almost zero muscular effort.
That is incredibly efficient. But when it came time to actually secure a kill, efficiency has to give way to explosive power, right? A triceratops isn't going to be brought down by an animal rhythmically bouncing toward it at 3 miles an hour.
No, definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
While it walked slowly to save calories, its skeletal layout was designed for terrifying close-quarters violence. Its powerful hind limbs featured incredibly thick femurs, and because its mass was centralized over its hips, it possessed very low rotational inertia.
What does that mean in practice?
Think of a figure skater pulling their arms in to spin faster. A T-Rex could pivot its massive bulk incredibly fast to snap at armored prey trying to outflank it.
Oh, wow. So they were quick on their feet.
Yeah, and from a stealthy ambush, it could launch into a short-distance, devastating sprint of 15 to 25 miles per hour. It was a heavily armored sprinter relying on its sensory radar to wait for the perfect moment.
That is terrifying. And with pneumatic, air-filled bones and heavily padded feet, it seems like they wouldn't just be restricted to the land either. Could an 8-ton animal actually be buoyant enough to swim?
Their anatomy suggests they were excellent swimmers, actually. The air pockets in their skeletal structure made them surprisingly buoyant for their size.
I'm just picturing this giant head cresting out of a lake.
It's very likely. And those heavily padded feet functioned effectively as paddles. They could easily cross deep rivers or navigate coastlines to pursue prey or claim new territory.
So we have this heavily armored, stealthy, swimming, sensory radar dish of an animal. How many of them does an ecosystem like that actually support?
That's a numbers game that paleontologist Charles Marshall and his team recently tackled. They took on the seemingly impossible task of calculating the population density of the T-Rex
How do you even calculate that?
by analyzing their geographic range, caloric needs, and physiological mass. And the numbers they produced are staggering. At any given moment in the late Cretaceous period, there were only about 20,000 adult T-Rexes alive on the entire planet.
Only 20,000. To put that spatial dominance into perspective for you guys listening, their population density was roughly one adult for every 40 square miles.
Yeah, they needed a lot of space.
If you were to drop the entire Cretaceous ecosystem directly onto modern-day New York, there would be exactly one adult T-Rex stalking the entirety of Manhattan Island.
That is a great way to visualize it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer scale of deep time fundamentally changes the math.
Right.
The T-Rex reigned as an apex predator for about 2.5 million years. That translates to roughly 127,000 generations.
Okay, so that adds up.
Yes. When you aggregate all of that over the eons, an estimated 2.5 billion T-Rexes lived and died on this planet.
2.5 billion 8-ton bone-crushing predators.
Exactly.
But that highlights something so beautifully tragic about the science of paleontology. If 2.5 billion of these animals existed, why aren't we tripping over their skulls every time we dig a foundation for a house?
Because the process of fossilization is essentially a geological lottery ticket.
Right.
The environmental conditions have to be perfectly, impossibly exact to bury an animal and slowly turn its bone into stone before it decays or is scavenged.
It's so rare.
It really is. Marshall's study calculated that we have only recovered the fossilized remains of about 1 in every 80 million T-Rexes that ever existed.
1 in 80 million.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? For you listening right now, the T-Rex isn't just a cool movie monster or a static museum piece. It is the ultimate shortcut to understanding how the scientific process actually works.
It really is.
It is constantly evolving. What we confidently thought was a slow, tail-dragging, scaly giant iguana in 1905 is now understood to be a highly complex, potentially feathered, lip-having, socially dynamic, and incredibly efficient ambush predator.
Absolutely.
It proves that science isn't a textbook, it's a living detective story.
And that leads to a profound final thought to leave you with today. If the T-Rex was the largest, most durable, bone-crushing predator on land, and yet Earth's geology only preserved 1 in 80 million of them, what else is entirely missing?
Oh, man.
What entirely bizarre, soft-bodied, or deeply strange creatures lived right under the T-Rex's feet for millions of years? Creatures that the Earth completely, utterly erased without leaving a single trace.
That is haunting.
The dinosaur record isn't just a story of what we have managed to find. It is a ghost story of everything we will never get to see.